Hello, and thanks for taking the time to listen to Reimagining Cyber. New episodes of the podcast drop every Wednesday. So to make sure you never miss a show, do hit the follow or subscribe button wherever you listen. You can also find us on the @Reimagining Cyber YouTube channel. Hello, and welcome to Reimagining Cyber. I'm Rob Aragao. A while back on Reimagining Cyber, we sat down with Dominic Brown of Graveslight Consulting to unpack one of the most ambitious regulatory shifts in European financial services, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, or DORA. At the time, it was looming, complex, and transformational. Now, over a year into its implementation, the question isn't what is DORA, it's what has DORA actually changed. To answer that question, I'm delighted to welcome Dominic back onto the show. Hey, Dom, thanks for being on again.
Hey, Rob, thanks for having me back.
Dom, so it's been a little while since obviously you and I have had this conversation, and you came in and educated the audience on DORA. It's been about 2 years, actually. So really early on. But again, it was prior to obviously everything kind of really going live from a deadline perspective, at least in 2025 for DORA. So we bring you back. We had a little sidebar on this, and there's a lot that's been going on. So we thought, hey, let's do a refresher. Why don't we just get started initiating with, hey, what is DORA for the audience members that aren't really up to date, and they can go back and replay the previous one. But just what's DORA at a top level, and why over this past year of 2025, now we're in 2026, it really mattered.
Sure. And thanks a lot for having me back. Glad to be here. A quick DORA overview. So DORA is an EU regulation designed to reduce cyber and resilience risk in EU financial services. It emanated out of the rapid digital transformation of financial services during the pandemic, where unfortunately cyber resilience didn't follow suit. So I think cyber attacks on European financial services more than doubled during the pandemic. It was a good impetus. The scope is really broad. It covers what's called ICT systems, stands for Information Communication Technology. That's any system delivering ongoing digital or data services. So I think it's probably harder to find a system that doesn't do that. This thing does do that. Core to this is the requirement first to identify their critical or important functions, the acronym is CIF, and the ICT systems that support those CIFs. And DORA is there's two levels of enforcement. One is level 1. It's basically the rule. And level 2 is how to implement the rule. And CIFs is sort of the focus of the level 2 requirements. And we'll get into that. DORA is based on 5 pillars. There's ICT risk governance, incident reporting, resilience testing, third-party risk management, and information sharing. It has a systemic focus, and this makes it unique in that it treats ICT risk as a threat to the entire EU financial system, not just to individual firms. It extends into third-party vendors, third-party ICT vendors, and the subcontracting chain of those vendors. It was applied in January 2025, so it's been a year. And the enforcement model is risk-based, right? It's a risk-based supervisory model. It's not tied to a fixed reporting period like the SEC cybersecurity rule. However, it does mandate incident reporting, and it also requires financial firms in the EU to submit a list of their current ICT systems. So they maintain a directory of that.
So Dom, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and I think this is where sometimes people, maybe in the US, don't kind of connect the dots to DORA and the reality of DORA actually potentially applying to them. And again, as you said, right, it's financial institutions, it's relative to the EU, but it's financial institutions that do business and operate within the EU. So there are US entity banks, very large banks, that are still needing to abide by DORA because they're doing business overseas. That's correct, isn't it?
That is correct. There's also the technology providers that support those banks, right? They could be an American company and that provides the tech stack, and that they're subject to DORA as well.
Yeah. So I think that's why it's important to call out from a global perspective when we're talking about this topic of DORA.
It's a good point too. It may be setting a precedent for regulations elsewhere, depending upon how successful it's going to be.
And you even kind of connected the dots back to, hey, there's the SEC cyber perspective that you have to take into account. But again, here's another one. And so again, it's really now being enforced for over the past year. And, one of the things that I'd love to get your perspective on, you've dug into this quite heavily, is the past year's reality. So what are some of the struggles that we've seen? What are some of the gaps relative to compliance? And what have we seen from the regulators?
Yeah, firms are pretty slow at building out their DORA frameworks, right? I think it's this incredibly expensive regulation, and I think some of this is due to the fact that the level 2 requirements you talked about weren't published until mid 2025. But things like, governance maturity, so board and senior management, governance of ICT risk is pretty immature. Firms have not fully identified their critical or important functions, the CIFs. Cybersecurity and resilience controls exist on paper, but not in practice. And this is, common from what you see in organizations, in some cases generally, but not necessarily relevant to DORA. And as a result of these difficulties, a lot of firms are asking for longer timelines to complete their DORA implementations, that is. And the regulators thus far have been really patient. No one's been penalized, but my sense is they're going to expect meaningful progress through 2026.
Okay. So we see this maturation in essence happening. We're expecting to see some example, unfortunately, of a penalty in essence that then makes people maybe move faster. But one of the things that you and I were chatting about previously as well was, within the year of 2025, mid-year or so, it sounded like you mentioned to me, was within the level 2 technical standards, which there are many, but 2 specifically that you want to talk about is threat-led penetration testing, as well as the third-party risk management side of the equation. So maybe kind of dig into that and a little bit of a flair to the audience of what those 2 elements coming into play and being enforced in 2025 are all about.
Sure. So 2 key level 2 standards are the resilience testing. So the threat-led, it's actually resilience testing in the form of threat-led penetration testing, and third-party risk management. Both of these came out in July. So firms, as I mentioned, building their framework, had to sort of wait for these to get published to sort of build it up fully. In some cases, you probably could have built the framework, but I also think it gave firms an excuse to sort of drag their feet a little bit. We'll start with the threat-led penetration testing. So this was originally essentially a different methodology. So what the EU is doing, they're using a TIBER-EU methodology. So this was a cyber framework that was published by the European Central Bank in 2018, and it was optional until it became mandated under DORA. And essentially what it is it's intelligence-led red team testing that runs an end-to-end attack simulation on production systems. It's pretty intense. The scope is logical. It targets the people, processes, and technologies supporting critical or important functions. So the CIFs and the ICT providers, a lot of acronyms here, supporting those CIFs and their subcontractors. Right? It's just designed not only to address technical gaps like patch management, things like that, it's also designed to address things like social engineering. Right? Firms are select based on their systemic risk to the financial system. Firms that are in scope need to be tested every 3 years. But that is discretionary, right? The supervisors can demand testing on a more frequent basis depending upon the risk. And so how it works, it's a pretty comprehensive framework. The regulator has a test manager that coordinates the test. The financial firm has a control team that works with the regulator. The control team is mandated to hire external threat intelligence and external red team testers. The regulators mandate external providers to ensure objectivity. And then there's a blue team within the financial firm, which ostensibly would be the cyber team or a portion of the cyber team that basically defends this test unaware that it's happening. And the timeline is firms get about 6 months preparation. This includes threat intelligence gathering, hiring the external providers, and then a 12-week penetration testing on live production systems. So your heart has to go out to that blue team that spends 12 weeks defending that test. But it's pretty comprehensive. Once the test is completed, the findings are documented, the remediation plan is agreed upon between the regulators and the financial services firm, and the remediation practice, if there is any, which there most likely will be, is tracked by the regulator and the financial services firm. There's also an attestation that the firm gets, an EU-wide attestation that from the regulator that the financial firm completed the testing and did it in a compliant way. And there's also a pooled option. Firms using the same ICT provider may conduct coordinated testing.
Okay, interesting. So a couple questions for you on this. So, well, one is just from an educational perspective to the audience, and I know people know this, but some may not. as they're listening in. So right on the pen testing side of it, as you described it, you mentioned red teaming, blue teaming. And red teaming is basically the people who are acting as the threat actors. Blue team are the people inside that are really trying to protect the organization and detect when things are trying to come through the door. So that's kind of just defining that as you called it out. You mentioned that this was something that kind of was brought forth back in 2018. And immediately my mind went to, well, in 2018, back in the EU, the GDPR also went into effect. Was there any sort of connection back between this pen testing element as well as GDPR, or is that just two separate things? Just out of curiosity, if you know.
It would make sense if there was. Nothing in sort of my research came up that said they were related, but
Okay.
it would make sense, right?
The timing, as soon as you mentioned it, I'm going, that seems like it did tie to the general data protection regulation. The other thing I want to ask you as we're talking about DORA is, have you been involved in any conversations where the financial firms are potentially viewing being in compliance, having the certifications in place for different elements as some form of competitive differentiator at all? Or are you seeing it more as like, hey, they're showing their risk reduction capabilities and in essence, maybe reducing their insurance costs? Like, I'm just trying to kind of connect the dots. And
No, totally. I work a lot in private equity, so a lot of fintechs are stressing the fact that their platforms provide this kind of security and information governance transparency. So the general partners are using that to attract investors, essentially limited partners. And the limited partners want the visibility because they want to understand if their investments are at risk. The general partners want that sort of security infrastructure and resilience and transparency because they want to attract investors, right? So it's seen as a competitive differentiator. Definitely in alternative investments, most likely across financial services.
Yeah, makes sense. So it's a route to market, but it's also, again, a market differentiator, as you said, right? It's a competitive differentiator for that.
It's just a total differentiator.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
So, here we are in the second year that DORA has truly gone into effect. So I wanted to get your perspective on, again, this year, the outlook, the changes that are ahead for organizations needing to abide by DORA.
One thing we didn't talk about is that also in the middle of the first year of DORA, the list of the critical third-party providers was published, right? So these are traditionally big cloud service providers that the EU regulators deemed as critical to the EU financial system. So organizations like Amazon, Google, and so forth, there's 19 of them. And that sort of fits into that. Basically, those organizations come under the purview of DORA, right? And they can be subject. They don't have the required pen testing, but the regulators can go in there the same as they can go into a financial services firm and demand to see controls and procedures. And if they need to, they'll do resilience testing. So it brings these big cloud providers under the same purview, which is interesting because they've pretty much been immune to that type of thing for a long time, right? That type of, their customers demanding resilience testing. So now they're subject to that, which kind of makes a bit of a level playing field. So in terms of what's happening in year two, what's happening next, I think we're essentially going really from a pilot phase where the regulators have shown a lot of patience to a production phase, right? So I think for financial firms, it's all about readiness, right? The security and resilience controls need to work in practice. I think the boards and senior management need to get involved and show that they're actively performing ICT governance. And I think the firms need to be prepared to be tested, the financial firms, the threat-led penetration testing if they're in scope, or at least show results from internal resilience testing. So the level 2 requirement is the threat-led penetration testing, but all the firms need to do resilience testing. Like I mentioned, it's a supervisory model. They don't mandate that you have to report on this, but you never know when they're going to knock on the door. And in the case that they do, you need to be prepared. Year two should also be interesting because the third-party risk management will be underway. We'll see how quickly firms can remediate contracts and how enforceable those contractual rights really are. So a core part of the third-party risk management and that technical standard is building the contractual controls that give financial firms the visibility into their ICT third-party contractors and the subcontracting chain. And it also requires them to control that chain and review any changes to their vendors, subcontractors, and also object to any changes that they don't like, right? So it provides the visibility into that whole subcontracting chain and actually requires financial firms to sort of manage that subcontracting on a proactive basis. Another thing we'll see in year two is more data-driven oversight by the regulators. The regulators will be using actual incident information to decide which financial firms to focus on and what sectors to focus on. You'll see firms leveraging exit capability built into these contracts. So if the third-party provider isn't living up to the requirements of DORA, we'll see if these firms can actually exit these contracts and move to another vendor. And the critical third-party supervision is going to be active. So we'll see how closely the regulators monitor the Amazons and the Googles of the world, and if it results in any meaningful changes on how these providers run their business, and which of these critical third parties the financial firms should choose to partner with. Because if it's difficult and you can't get any traction with one of these big cloud services providers, it may be an opportunity for a competitor to appeal to these financial firms, right? That's what I see in changes ahead.
Okay, makes sense. So time for Dominic to look in about a year from now, we're having this conversation, right? What do you see over the course of this year you think really changes? You talked about some of the things for sure just now, but my key question for you is, when we're talking a year from now and recapping, do you feel that there's really going to be kind of an example or multiple examples of where it's truly inserted itself as costly, some sort of pain is inflicted on these organizations that are not truly abiding by the DORA standards and frameworks in place?
Yeah, I mean, what I think needs to happen, and I've been doing sort of compliance and cybersecurity for a long time. I was an compliance practice manager at EMC, and built a practice around e-discovery, which was brand new at the time. And there were a lot of firms chose to ignore it, right? The fines were in the billions of dollars, right? So everybody, they saw that and they said, okay, I don't want that to happen to me. I don't want this to happen to my career as the chief legal officer of an organization. I think it's going to be a similar thing here. I think if you willfully ignore implementing DORA, you're going to suffer the consequences. And the consequences are like 1% to 2% your annual sales. That's a ton of money, a ton of bad press. And it's bad press around things you should be doing anyway and things your customers care about, which is cyber and operational resilience. You don't want to put your money in a bank or a private equity firm that is vulnerable and could potentially lose that money. I think the common thread and what I've found in compliance, the federal rules of civil procedure, British common law, no matter what it is, including compliance regulations, is firms need to put in a good faith effort proportional to their impact, in this case, the EU financial system. Right? And they need to be adults and say, okay, this is what I need to do. This is why I need to do it. And they need to put in that good faith effort. I think if they do that, even if they fall short of implementing DORA to the letter, they'll be okay. Right? But you can't be blind to it and ignore it. You need to respect it and work at building up that frame.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that's the reality, as you said, with your experience and going through multitudes of different compliance standards. The reality is when the penalties actually come down, that's when the teeth are there to be able to support, hey, we better start paying attention to this. And the other organizations are going to start actually taking action more effectively because they see these examples of what the actual costs could be for them. So, Dom, thanks so much for coming on. It's been due to be able to get an update on where we stand with DORA, and we will definitely be doing another update as we see this continue to progress, because it is much more of an opportunity for organizations to truly apply what we learned back in the days of 2020 with the need for resiliency being applied. We've had conversations in the past in multiple episodes of the podcast all around cyber resilience and operational resiliency and the connection of the two of those. DORA is one of the real kind of, again, standards and frameworks out there that helps really show you the path forward and how you can actually truly operationalize the need to implement proper cyber resilience. So again, thanks for coming on and sharing your perspective on this.
Yeah, sure thing, Rob. Thanks for having me back. Happy to share the information.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Thanks for listening to Reimagining Cyber. Don't forget to follow or subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'll be back next Wednesday. Goodbye.